Hello and welcome to another episode of Kick Unhealthy Relationships to the Curb. I am your host, Stephanie McPhail, and the co-host, Steve Vaccaro, does not look like he will be able to join us today. He is off doing some wonderful things in the community, as always. Maybe he'll be able to pop in. We'll get a surprise welcome from him, but I'm not sure. So you're going to have to deal with, it's going to be a ladies' night tonight. I am super excited to be able to introduce our guest who will be coming on in a minute. If this is your first time coming on to our show, say hello in the comments. We would love to hear from you. And also too, if there's any topics that you would like us to discuss, please make sure that you share in the comments what you'd like to see more of, maybe see less of. But this is really all about kicking unhealthy relationships to the curb, meaning all relationships. Relationships could be with food, it could be with aging, it could be with work issues. It doesn't just have to be romantic relationships. And, we do have relationships in general, such an important part of us as human beings. And having done this now for the past 10 years, I see how much this affects us on so many different levels. So if there's anything in particular you'd like to see more of from us, make sure you let us know and we can find a guest to help share that information with all of you. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephanie McPhail. I am a professional coach. I have written 2 books called Being Loved Shouldn't Hurt. I actually have a book and a workbook. They are available on Amazon. It's called Being Loved Shouldn't Hurt, Recognize and Overcome Toxic Relationships. Thanks, Jack. So you can create your best life now. And the book is really all about my story of healing from toxic relationships, how I was in the cycle of it. I just kept finding new partners and having the same types of results in relationships until I decided one day that enough was enough. And I decided to take my power back and make a complete shift in my life. And then I went on to interview some other people who had a similar experience. And then I also go on to share some of the tips and tools that readers can use to start healing themselves as well. And then there's a workbook that goes along with it. So you can just get the book by itself, or you can get the workbook to help you really start navigating what you need to do to heal. And you can always go to beinglovedshouldn'thurt.com/links, and you can get a signed copy of my book and workbook. And we're actually going to be offering some other things in the next week or so for anyone who needs some extra support. So saying all of that, I want to say again, thank you for coming and hanging out with us. I am going to introduce you to our guest, who's someone that I got to meet a few months ago now. And as we started chatting, I said, I think it's really important that I get her on the show to get her to share her story. I think it's really going to resonate for all of you. So help me in welcoming Amparo Vasquez to the show. Welcome, Amparo. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Stephanie?
Very, very good. So, saying all of that big intro, tell us a little bit about you and your story.
Hi, everyone. It's very nice to meet you. My name is Amparo. I am the founder of Azteca, which is based off of my own experience of surviving and healing from various forms of abuse, including covert narcissistic abuse in a relationship, but including systemic oppression. I'm a woman of color. And so one of the things that I realized in leaving that experience as an adult is that abuse is abuse is abuse, no matter where you experience it. If it's at home, if it's at work, if it's by way of our systems. And so the impact is the same, just depending on the severity of your experience itself and sort of the tactics that are used and the strategy behind the tactics. And so when I emerged, I realized, wow, all of society makes it really easy to be a victim. All of society makes it really hard to know what you're living. All of society makes it really hard to escape and help and rebuild yourself after this experience. So as I was healing and climbing up and dealing with things like PTSD, CPTSD, signs of brain damage from the experience of such severe and constant gaslighting, which was the majority of what I experienced, a lot of mental abuse, I was just so ardent about, I need to do something about this. This is so horribly unacceptable. So I'm at the beginning of that, what I'm sure will be a lifelong effort to create whole things, eventually whole systems that are meant to shift a lot of things, to make it easier for people to understand this is not okay, regardless of where you're experiencing it. The tactics are predictable. The impact is predictable. You get things like PTSD and brain damage from not just physical abuse, but mental abuse as well. And here's how you get your life back. Here's how to heal, which you can.
I would love, so, it's so interesting because, there's different layers and levels of abuse. And, and I think when we're in it, we try to make sense of it, or for me, I tried to kind of lower the extent of what it was in my mind for my own just like survival. And so I'll have clients that will say, well, mine wasn't as bad as like yours because there was
Yeah.
physical abuse. And I used to say, well, mine isn't as bad as somebody else because I have no bruises. Like, so, it's interesting how we downplay the abuse that we've had.
Yeah.
What were some, like, what could you tell someone, like, what are some of the, and again, I think the brain damage, I don't think people realize how severe that from purely mental abuse. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. One is downplaying your own experience of abuse is a common factor. Not even a common factor, it's a common sign. So it's really easy now as a survivor for me to pinpoint someone who may be undergoing abuse. And that's one of the things that you'll see. Oh, it's not that bad. It's not as bad as this. But you can see in their face, you can see in their body language that there's still an instinctive part of them that knows that it's not a small deal. So there's always some sort of discrepancy that you'll notice between their words and the way that they're reflecting those words. In terms of the brain damage that one gets from mental abuse, I had no idea. I was rescued. I didn't know that I was living abuse because the vast majority of it was covert. The vast majority of it was mental abuse. So over time, I was convinced that I was the problem. I was an angry monster. I deserved the experiences that I was having. I was exaggerating what I was living through. I couldn't trust what my eyes saw, what my ears heard, while the same person was presenting a very different face publicly to friends, to family, which confused me. And it's just very confusing when you're in the middle of that. People who are not in the middle of that don't understand what it's like. It's like a cave of brainwash, is how I describe it. The further you go into that experience, the more brainwashed you become, and the harder it becomes to tell reality from fiction or from the experience that you're having. So, didn't know. I was rescued. Within about a week, I had the experience of repressed memories coming to the surface of my psyche. Had no idea that I was repressing anything. I had a clue that suppression was one of my survival tactics, in that I did something called maladaptive daydreaming when I was younger, but I didn't know that I was suppressing outright memories and insights as a result. Had that experience and then very quickly realized there's something wrong with my brain. I had really weird like activity in my frontal lobe. It didn't feel like a headache. I felt a part of inside of my skull that I'm not supposed to be feeling. It felt weird. And I had such a hard time making basic decisions of whether I wanted to leave the bed or eat or leave the home. I couldn't, here was the biggest sign for me. I couldn't conceptualize hours into the future, let alone beyond. I couldn't conceptualize it. I couldn't think about it. How do you plan for the future? How do you plan what you're going to eat? How do you prepare the process to take the steps that are necessary to ensure that you're going to be fed if you can't even conceptualize and plan for 3 hours ahead in the future? So it was all those things pinpointed to the possibility that I was dealing with something like that, and I researched it, and that's when I found out, yes, you can actually have brain damage from narcissistic abuse, which is what I experienced, covert narcissistic abuse. So that was a big deal. Had no idea. I'm aware that most of the world doesn't know. Most of the world still conceptualizes abuse as physical abuse, and even that is downplayed in a lot of places. It's not that big of a deal. No, abuse. Here's the thing. Abuse has such a huge impact on your brain. It has such a physical, literal impact on your brain, on your personality, on your nervous system. You come to associate normal, ordinary, benign things like love, like care, like touch, like bedrooms with harm. And so it makes it really hard to just be a human being. And we know that when you take it to a systemic level, so things like poverty, which is a form of systemic abuse, it breaks down your health at the cellular level, which is what you experience when you're being abused on an individual level as well. So there are tremendous health impacts, and your body shows that to you. Your body starts to break down over time. And we're taught all these isms in society that make us think, oh, the reason why I'm starting to break down, the reason why I'm starting to have all of this deterioration of my physical health or my mental health is because I'm getting older, or it's because of this factor and this factor. Instead of challenging those isms and then seeing what actually might be causing it there, then and there. So after I left that situation, I de-aged. So I started to see like physical signs of deterioration in my face. I started to have really bad heart palpitations. I thought I was going to have a heart attack by my mid 30s. My hips were awful. I thought I was going to need a hip replacement as well by my late 30s. I was having like weird tingling sensations on top of my head that made me think that I was going bald. My face from here was bright red. The color difference between this part of my body and this part of my body was stark. A lot of that left within weeks to months of my escaping, which taught me the stuff that I thought was contributed to or caused by aging was not. It was caused by this other situation entirely. So there's a lot of things that are normalized in our households and in our schools and in our homes and I already said homes, but in society that makes it really easy for us to not know what we're living.
Well,
And
and I think to jump in on that, because I had the same experience. I had back issues. I had polycystic ovarian syndrome. I was getting migraines. Like I mean, the list, I got a blood clot. I mean, everything that could possibly go wrong.
yeah,
And then I'd have comments from the doctors that say, well, you are getting older. Like, dude, I was like 34 years old, 35 years old, but I think, but then it goes on to that other layer of also being female. Then there's also doctors are not necessarily listening to females. And then
yeah,
maybe,
medical gaslighting.
and then for like a woman of color, then you have that layered on top. So that's like, there's all these different layers that I think people are not aware of. And I think something you said before, like the covert narcissism, one of the biggest things that frustrates the heck out of me is when people say like, well, what's wrong with her? Why didn't she leave when she was being abused? If she was being so badly abused, why didn't she leave? Well, that question just annoys the heck out of me. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things. One, to what you said at the very beginning, this is why I say that all of society makes us easy victims, easy targets, and makes it hard to escape, because medical gaslighting, things like people telling you, oh, all relationships get hard over time, stick it out, that's common. So you're surrounded by influences that make it really hard to understand that this stuff is not within the realm of normal, that you don't deserve it, that you need to get the hell out and protect yourself above everything else. So in terms of your second question, I lost my train of thought.
Totally fine. The covert narcissism about why women or when people in general don't get out. Like why would they stay when someone's treating them, if there's someone's treating them so badly?
Yes. So the answer to that question is very complicated, and it includes things like you often, when you're in an abusive situation as an adult, you often were in an abusive situation as a child. So you grew up with it being deemed as on some level normal. It doesn't set off those red alerts that it would for someone else who didn't have that experience growing up, which is what happened to me. I grew up with covert narcissism in very close quarters. So I didn't know that I had been molded to see these things as normal. I didn't know that I had been molded to think that I was unworthy of receiving genuine care at all, period, let alone like if I didn't work for it, right? And again, there's all these societal influences, right? All these isms of like, only good things come from hard work. So you internalize this messaging as if it's easy, then it's unrealistic or it's not worth it. And so that translates to, oh, I can't expect my relationship to be easy. And if it's hard work, it's okay. Let me just stick it out. I can stick it out and I can make it to the other side. And so adding the layer of like covert versus overt abuse on top of that, which is what you were asking about. So there's different classifications of abuse when it comes to narcissism. There's overt, covert, altruistic, and malignant. So it's sort of on a spectrum of how obvious that abuse is, how blatant that abuse is. And malignant is the one that's the most obvious, where they're yelling at you in front of friends in public, and they're hitting you in the face and they're leaving black eyes, or it's just very, very obvious. From there, it goes to overt, covert, altruistic. Altruistic are those people that are the hardest to spot because they're the leaders of NGOs or the spiritual leaders who are mistreating their wives, cheating on them, cutting down their self-esteem, destroying them from the inside out. So at a certain point, when you go from overt to covert, it's a lot more internal destruction than just focus on external externally obvious destruction. And what I read was the reason why that tends to happen is because the abuser perceives him or herself as having less power influence in the world, so they're less able to get away with certain things, and so they do things more so in hiding. And then there's, again, covert is a lot harder to spot. So covert and altruistic narcissism are known as the worst forms of abuse. So they cut you down from the inside. It's death by 1,000 cuts. They get access to your subconscious and they completely rewrite you from the inside out. It's a form of brainwash. And so when I escaped from the situation, I realized that I had been brainwashed, and it was awful. It was very much like waking up to a nightmare, to realize that my perception of myself, this core foundational thing, your perception of myself, my perception of myself, had been rewritten. And the reason why I was able to acknowledge that and understand that about myself is finally away from all the gaslighting, which felt like coming out of a cloud, which is how a lot of people describe it. You feel like you're coming out of a cloud. Reality started to make sense to me, and I started to remember a lot of things, including who I used to be, who I was in between childhood abuse and adult abuse. I had had 7 years of safety where I got a chance to experience who I really was. That person saved me. Those 7 years saved me because they showed me who I really was in the experience of safety. And I wasn't this angry monster who was always on the verge of suicide and depression, always unhinged, that I both became and was presented as. I was taught that that's who I was by my abuser later on when I was being abused. And so there's so much about the experience of abuse that even people who have undergone abuse don't understand because it's not regularly studied. The experience of abuse, what it actually is torture and brainwash. That's what it really is. You become sort of akin to a prisoner of war inside of this relationship, even though you don't know it. You can't tell because you're, even if you're being physically barred from going certain places, often your prison is your home, right?
Mhm.
Your prison is the relationship itself. And so they do things like make sure to isolate you from anyone who would be able to challenge them. They pit you against them. So over time, I became very isolated from friends and family, and I thought it was my fault. I didn't, excuse me, I didn't realize that it wasn't my fault. Over time, I started to associate people with discomfort and lack of safety. So I started to separate myself from most people in general. Um, they very intentionally treat you better in front of certain people that hold that conception of them, so that they reinforce this idea that they're the good guy and you're crazy. There's something wrong with you for being upset with them. They completely put you into sort of the concept of an echo chamber. They create one for you, and they put you square inside of it, and they work over time to destabilize your ability and to cut at your ability to be able to emerge out of that echo chamber, including through isolation, including through gradual increased gaslighting, including through financial abuse, including through financial dependency over time. So that's something else that I experienced, is that I racked up a lot of debt over the course of that relationship because I was paying our rent, because I was doing X, Y, and Z, because I kept having to buy all of our food while my abuser kept claiming that he wasn't eating our food. But miraculously, I had a lot more money for food after I left. And and my confidence was shattered, was broken over the course of that experience. So my ability to be able to show up as someone who could do the job, whether in a workplace or in my own business, was completely shot. How do you survive? How do you make money? How do you, in this society in which you're forced to, you have no choice but to. And so all of that is something that's very common for victims, for survivors, and they become financially dependent over time. And then they really have very minimal physical, tangible ways of being able to escape, if they can even understand that what they're living is not normal and that it's bad, that it's wrong. So here's another example of a contributor to this. They do horrendous crap to you, and then they pretend like nothing happened. And it's the craziest thing. And it ramps up over time. So I can tell you that one of the most obvious examples of this happened a couple of times in the later half of my experience in this. Once was when my abuser completely lost touch with reality, and I genuinely feared for my life. I had to monitor where the knives were in my home because the person that I was staring at was staring at me like I was not a human being. And he was trying to start a physical fight with me, but grabbing my wrist so that I would hit him first so that he could say that. He could say that we had a fight and she started it. And I was still of sound mind. So I was aware that this person was staring at me in a way that was very life threatening. And in the back of my head, I was thinking, where are the exits? Where are the knives? Where are the exits? Where are the knives? And I tried calming him down, and I tried recording him, because it's a thing that I started to do is he would get into these like really scary modes, and I believed that that's not who he was. I thought I just need to prove it to him. That's another thing that victims have all in common. It's like this, I just need to prove it to them. I just need to prove it to them. I just need another way of explaining it. I just need more evidence, more proof, more proof. They're just misremembering. What is this? Because you think that they genuinely care about you. You can't even take into consideration that they're intentionally lying to you and intentionally hurting you because it makes them feel better, which is what was happening. So I pulled out my phone to record, and then he reacted in a way that was very threatening and violent as well. I tried to run into the bedroom. He tried to force himself in at that point. It was terrifying. It was terrifying. That was one of the few times that I've considered calling the cops on someone that I love, and I grew up in the hood. It's huge that I grew up in the hood, and that was one of the few times that I've ever considered calling the cops on a person that I know. And the very next day, we went to go see his family for a play. And he told me that he had told his brother what had happened. And I believed him. And I had to pretend like I was normal, even though I felt incredibly unsafe and uncomfortable. I had to pretend like everything was normal. But I thought at least his brother knows. And I gave his brother a really big hug because his brother is a genuinely good person who is just unwittingly an enabler. And what I realized after I escaped was a normal, rational person like his brother wouldn't have responded to me so casually if he had really known what I had lived through. And so this is so common. They'll do crazy crap to you. They will be extremely harmful. They'll become a devil. And then they'll pretend like nothing happened. And it makes you think you're crazy. It makes you question yourself. Am I really making things up? Am I exaggerating? And it happened over and over and over again. And so my saving grace was finally talking to a professional near the end of my experience when I was very broken. My abuser had already moved on, but was pretending that he hadn't, and was trying to like get me to leave him so that it looked like it was my fault. It was a very complicated picture that he was trying to present, which is why it started to break down. And I sought help. And with this one person, after so many people had tried to get through to me and I had pushed them away because I couldn't accept the possibility that my soulmate didn't love me, didn't care about me, was intentionally trying to hurt me, right? Just how a lot of us, a lot of victims think is that they've met their soulmates, how it feels at the very beginning because they remind you of home. And this person, I slipped in one thing that I had experienced, an example of verbal abuse that I didn't know was a big deal anymore, which is why I slipped it in. I just casually mentioned it, but he grabbed onto it because he knew. So he grabbed onto it and he was like, have you ever experienced anything like that before? I was like, well, yeah, this time and this time and this time. And he yelled at me in the car and he did this and this and this. And he paused and he said, you know, I have some bad news for you. I can't help you with this because if I help you with this, it might mean you going back to that person and that would mean harm to you. And that was the first time that anyone was able to get through to me because I was so used to minimizing what I had gone through. I was so used to downplaying it. I was so used to taking responsibility. I was so used to over explaining and over forgiving. I was in a very warped state of mind at that point because you get conditioned to be in that state of mind. And that person got through to me. And because that person got through to me, the next time that I experienced verbal abuse, mental abuse, I paused. And this time I was able to notice things that I hadn't been able to notice before because I had been so reactionary, which is another thing that abusers try to do. You can't put all the pieces together if you're always on edge, if you're always reacting, if you're always exhausted, which is what they do. It's what I lived through, intentional sleep deprivation. Do you know how hard it is to go through an hour of class? Let's throw that example. You got 3 hours of sleep. How well can you concentrate? Well, extend that out, right? Your abuser very often intentionally deprives you of sleep because it gives them a feeling of control over you. So add that layer on top of it. Add on top of that you're now dealing with increased PTSD and CPTSD, which is also affecting your brain and your brain's ability to be able to grasp and cope and properly process, and it starts to enter into more states of adrenaline and stress. So you're more regularly in a state of fight, flight, freeze, forget. There's like 6 other stress responses that we don't know of. And the longer that you stay in that, the more that it trains your brain to stay there, and you do not have access to their full faculties when you're stuck in a state of stress. You do not. So the experience of abuse is very complicated, and it is torture and brainwash. That's what it is.
And that's, and again, and I love that answer. And thank you so much for explaining that, because I think that, again, that is such a good reason of why we stay stuck. So look at this. We've got Steve on. Steve, welcome to the show.
I just got to make sure you're doing your job. You're doing a good job. But my friend, that story is very inspirational, because what you're doing to turn things around. Can I jump in and ask a quick question, Stephanie? I'm sorry.
Go for it.
To the party. But when you said, this is to help others, when you said you had to stop to take a pause to break that pattern, what did that mean for you? What kind of pause? What can you tell people to break that pattern? What should they do during that pause to reflect or to kind of overview things that are happening?
Yeah. So in the experience of abuse, you're always reacting. You're always reacting. You're walking on eggshells. You always have to anticipate what shoe is going to drop. You have to anticipate their moods. There's a lot of anticipation and a lot of reacting. And so they bank on that, because if you're not pausing, you're not putting the pieces together, you're not realizing what's actually going on. And so what happened at this point in time is, after that conversation that I had, he was a relationship coach. I was sitting on a very vivid memory that I don't think I'll ever forget. So I was sitting on a couch in the bedroom, and I was having a conversation with my abuser. And my abuser, I was trying to, once again, explain the impact of his behavior on me, once again, for the millionth time. Somehow he was able to turn that conversation around and convince me that I was the angry monster, which he had been trying to do for years. He had been trying to convince me for years that my anger was a problem, which is what you experience. You experience as a victim of abuse. They try to convince you that your reaction is the problem. You experience it as a person, a marginalized person in society. You're the angry woman of color. You're the angry Black woman. You're the angry person. If you fight back against your oppressors, you're the problem. You're the problem. You're the problem. You're the problem. You're not allowed to defend yourself. Mm-hmm. And so when I had that experience, if I hadn't had that conversation with my relationship coach first, that would have been the end of me. I'm certain of it, because I was dying. Things were not playing out well for me. It's why I was rescued, because I was dying at that point in time. But because I had had that conversation with my relationship coach for the first time, I think in that entire experience, I paused after I said that of, oh, I'm so sorry for being this angry person, blah, 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 blah. And I noticed his reaction with no response from me. None. I just watched. And even in the state of thinking what I'm living through is in the realm of normal, even with that, no idea that I was being abused, what I saw was confusing. What I saw was this person being gleeful and happy. What I saw was this person unable to reciprocate. Oh, I'm a genuine reciprocation. He tried, and I could tell that it was very fake, even at that point. Like, oh, I'm so sorry that you're feeling this way. I love you, blah, 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 blah. The normal thing that one would experience in a normal relationship with this sort of genuine back and forth, you would experience care, you would experience comfort, and you would experience reciprocation. He got very gleeful, and then he jumped on his phone, posted on social media that we were going to do something as a couple the next day, which was bizarre to me, not only because of what we had just experienced, but also because I'd had foot surgery recently. I couldn't walk easily, which is a component of my escape story. I was hobbling to run to the airport to get to the airplane on time because I had a literal hole in my foot that I was healing. And it was that pause that saved me, that I was able to see, okay, this person can't reciprocate. He can't reciprocate. He's acting real strange. And so this person will never learn. So that was the pause.
Stephanie, almost out of time. You want to take us home?
Yeah, so we're actually over time, and we can keep talking about this because I wanted to talk about, the systemic abuse and poverty and all that kind of other stuff. Tell us really, really quickly, how can people follow you and find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can go to my website. It's www.astekah.com, ASTEKAH.com. I'm on Instagram at Azteca_. And on my website, you can sign up for my newsletter. I'm in the early stages of building all this out. That's including all of these different components of including information about individual abuse and systemic abuse and the impact of it and validation around it and how to heal from all of it and how to connect all of the dots. I want people to connect all of the damn dots, because once you can see it, once you do things like pausing, which is a huge component of my approach, a lot of pausing, a lot of getting back into the body, a lot of validation, a lot of coming back into yourself, that's when we can heal.
Agreed. Well, thank you so much. Sorry, Steve, you are muted. It's a little bit loud on your end anyway, but thank you so much for coming on, Steve. We appreciate it. Amparo, so great to hear your story. We're going to definitely have to have you on again because, again, so much information and always such a short period of time. But thank you again for the work that you're doing. Definitely go check out Azteca.com, and we will see you on the next episode. Bye, everyone. Have a great night.